In this lesson, we'll see how to model up a site base for the project. Now, I pulled up the reference image of the site, which is in your referenced file folder, and it allows us just to have a look at what the site looks like and what we're going to be modeling. Now, the notable elements that we want to include in the site model is the two lines of the river bank. We have a bridge on this side and we have another one that is just out of the view on the right. Then we obviously have the width of the river and the surface of the water that we want to represent. And lastly, we'd like to get some notion of this building being as a backdrop and being aligned with our site. So these are the important elements to try and keep and represent within your site model. Now, I'm going to remind you again and again throughout this course that we're going to try and do this as if we were modeling or making a physical model out of card, just for the site at least. Now, if you're familiar with how architectural models work, or at least look, you would want to just cut this out as a simple extrusion and then just taper the roof off. You wouldn't necessarily go and start modeling all the windows. You wouldn't want to get all of this edging in place, and you wouldn't really be concerned with those details because you know that you just want to represent the scale and the placement of these objects. And that's really all that we're going to try and get across in this lesson. So I'm going to now close this down and let's have a look at our CAD outline, which, as I mentioned last time, was the bare bones of what we need just to get those reference objects in place. That view that was taken more or less from about over here. So that is where our museum is going to be, two bridges, and then the river with our site. So let's now go into the top view. I'm just going to hit G on the keyboard to turn off that grid. And I'm going to make a new layer, which is going to be called 01 context. And I generally like to have a double-digit prefix to all of my layers in CAD and 3D. So generally all of my CAD layers will be 00. All of the base and fundamental objects will be on 01, and then the numbers will increase as the priority decreases. So if I have furniture or planting, that'll be right at the bottom of the stack. So I can basically focus on my main layers at the top, which are important to the model. Next, I'm going to choose a usable color. So let's say something like this. And we can also go and choose a layer color for that entire layer. So generally for something like a site, you want it to be either gray or dark blue so that you don't really see it too much. Let's go and make it this dark green color. Now I'm going to start with the context layer selected as my active layer, and I'm going to start by drawing a polyline with the initial and drag being corner and corner. Hit S or click on your snaps toggle button on the keyboard, and then just start tracing out that line that you had created in 3ds Max. So here you can turn your snaps on and off if you need to. I'm just going to basically snap onto my CAD geometry that we drew earlier. If you need to pan across, you can't do it with your middle mouse button as you do in CAD, so you're going to rather use the I key on your keyboard. I'm going to close that spline, and before I start drawing the second spline for this part, I'm going to make sure that Start New Shape is not selected, which means that when I start drawing, I'm going to basically continue with that same existing object. That means I'm going to rather have one object instead of two separate ones, so that I can extrude and work on them together. And that already brings me to one of the first tips that I'm going to be sharing, is that in order to create a really quick workflow, you want to have as few objects as possible in your entire scene. What that means is that you don't really want to fuss with having hundreds or even more separate objects that you have to individually copy modifiers to and instance them all amongst each other. It's much easier to have a very simple and low amount of base objects and then to work on them as one. So I'm going to be repeating that idea as we go along through this course so that you can see. So immediately now I can go and extrude this upwards. So type in EXT, enter, and I can extrude it up by, let's say, 8 meters. And that 8 meters has been taken as an eyeball figure by looking at my reference photos from the site. Next, I want to create the water layer that is going to be the river. So what I can do here is either, if I'm in a very, very big hurry, I can create a flat plane that goes from corner to corner. So just to quickly show you that, you can either create a simple plane just by dragging and snapping to your corners and then moving it into the correct position. I'm rather going to do something a little bit more complex, is to create a copy of this object. So I'm going to type Control V, make a copy, isolate that copy, and then I'm going to work on that spline just by deleting a few of the edges here. And I'm going to move, let's just delete these two. I'm going to right click, choose Create Line, and then just join my lines as so. Once you've drawn all of that, just select all the corners, right click, weld all of that in place, and then you can also check by selecting it and just making sure that one vertex is selected. Then you'll see that once that is done, it's extruding now to a new object, which is going to be your river. So this, we don't necessarily need an extrusion. We can also simply have just an editable poly modifier, which is going to just make it a flat, simple object. Later, if you do want to add some physical waves and other properties to that, then we can have a look at how to add more detail later in the course. But for now, I just want to get all of the base objects out as quickly and simply as possible. So again, you'll see that I want to keep my editable spline as my base object. I'm not going to convert it to an editable poly. I want to keep things as reduced as possible in the bottom of the stack. And that is a really, really important thing to remember so that things become editable later on. So next I'm going to be creating these bridges, and in this case we can actually go and choose to copy the entire layer. So let's type Control V to that linked geometry layer. And if you remember from earlier on in this course, we discussed that if you want to use geometry from CAD that has been linked, you just copy it and you can then go and manipulate a copy of it and use it in your 3D Max file. I've now selected these two bridge objects, and just at the same time I'm going to select this building as well. I'm going to type Control I to invert the selection, delete the rest, select the building. Since it's not going to be modeled with the bridges, it's going to be a separate object. And I'm going to scroll down and hit detach. That means I now have an object for my bridge, a separate spline object for the building, and I can now go and model up these objects. So I'm going to convert this, or at least add an editable poly modifier. So I'm just go to editable poly, ED, and that's going to now show it as a filled object. And here what we can do is, let's first of all detach these towers. So we're going to go down and detach those, just in the way that we did the entire building. And this can be extruded. Just going to extrude it by a random amount, and we're going to adjust that later. And I'm going to move this up by, let's say, 20 meters for now, and extrude that as well. If you just want a shortcut for copying and pasting modifiers without necessarily instancing them, you can just take that modifier and drag it onto new objects. And that gets done very, very quickly. So in a few clicks, we have basically modeled up our site. What you also want to do is you just make sure that those objects that you had now created from your referenced files, that you change the layer. So you select on the layer, just click the little plus, and basically you will now have your very, very crude site model up in place. Just before I finish this lesson, one thing that I did want to talk about for the last minute is just the decision that you need to make each time to find out where your zero level will be in the Z or in the Z axis. What that means is that since we started extruding upwards, our river at the moment is at 0. And if we have a look at the top plane of this shore, or at least the surface of the ground, it's at 8 meters. So it's an important decision to know where in your model you want that reference datum 0 line to be. In my case, I know that the barge will be floating just above the water, so perhaps it's 1 or 2 meters above. So it would be a good idea for that ground surface of that barge to be our 0 level. That means that I would ideally want to take this entire model now and move it downwards by 2 meters. So let's go and quickly do that. So we type in -2, and then you'll see that once you draw in your barge, so let's just go in and very rapidly do that. I'm going to extrude it downwards this time, and I'm going to move it. And immediately you'll see that by extruding it downwards, that top surface is at exactly 0. If I just add an editable poly modifier, you can have a look at that. It's now at 0. There we go. And everything else is basically at its own different height around it. I can also go and move my bridge up into place slightly. So let's just select those bridges and move them up by 8 meters. And then you'll basically see that we've now completed our site model. We're going to edit this and basically carry on working on it. So that is going to all be handled further on in the course as we continue. So hang around for the other lessons as we go and add more detail to these buildings and to the site and context model.